is whiteness? What is whiteness? What do we mean by that? How does that fit into our conversations around race and racism? Oftentimes, my experience has been that usually when people have conversations around race, we think that conversations around race should only center and talk about people of color, but it never really reflects deeply on what whiteness is and how does that shape the whole dynamic as well. So what I suggest is that we need to actually reframe the conversation quite a bit to take seriously this idea of whiteness as it develops in the West and what it means and signifies for our society. So I'm going to start with a quote by, I only take the most serious of thinkers, so you will see next slide. Like I said, only the most serious of thinkers. So this is something that Chris Rock said. I'll give some context. It's a little dated, so don't ignore the Obama reference. It's a little dated, but his points, he wants to make a point about progress and the idea of progress, black progress and white progress. He says this: so to say Obama is progress is saying that he's the first black person that is qualified to be president. That's not black progress, that's white progress. There's been black people qualified to be president for hundreds of years. The question is, my kids are smart, educated, beautiful, polite children. There have been smart, educated, beautiful, polite black children for hundreds of years. The advantage that my children have is that my children are encountering the nicest white people that America has ever produced. Let's hope America keeps producing nicer white people. Obviously a bit of a joke, but he says something there that actually is worth thinking about, right? And what he says is that there have always been gifted, talented, intellectual black people capable, right, of governing, capable of leading, capable of doing all kinds of stuff, right? The only difference between the opportunities that, what would be like Robert Delaney and Frederick Douglass and all these folks, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and all these people, the only difference between what they're experiencing now and what we're experiencing is that there's white people that are at least willing to give some space for black people to participate at higher levels than previously, right? And so for him, that's not black progress, that's white progress, right? Now, you think about that historically, like you think about if you've read books like W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk and other early 20th century thinkers, usually and they were brilliant, right? But they would even often just inherit the language and frameworks of the time. And so they would talk about race primarily as the Negro problem, right? That would be the language. What are we going to do about the Negro problem? But if we're going to take seriously that we're talking about a society that has 400 years of white control and domination, and that has largely shaped the character and nature of our society, then the Negro problem isn't sufficient in describing the problem altogether. And so what happens when we actually invert the scrutiny, so to speak, right? To turn our gaze in the other direction and our analysis in the other direction and figure out, what does it mean to be white? Why did Europeans become white to begin with, right? And even as the church, what are the implications, the theological implications, the Christian implications for that kind of social performance? So those are some of the questions I want to address together. Next. So I was once at this gathering in DC of Christian leaders who were working, a bunch of different justice leaders working on a whole variety of issues. And it was like a convening of folks, like 300 folks there together. And they had these special lunch times where during your lunch you'd kind of convene around the kind of work that you've been specifically doing, right? So some people are there on mass incarceration and economics and environment and all kinds of stuff, right? So I thankfully, and it was invitation only to these lunches, so you couldn't just like invite yourself to whatever lunch you wanted to be. So the one I got invited to was one on race, and so I went, and it was kind of neat for me. There was a lot of great folks, civil rights leaders like C.T. Vivian were there, and Otis Moss III was there, and Lisa Sharon Harper. There's a whole range, right, of folks who have been doing work on race for a long time. on racism. And the conversation was just as rich as you might imagine. Like, we just jumped right in, and people were having like really serious conversations. And somebody brought up, I can't remember who it was who brought it up, but somebody quickly jumped to the conversation around what it means to be white. And they said, if whiteness is about social dominance, right? If that's why people became white, so that they could dominate and control other people, then whiteness is incompatible with Christian discipleship, right? That if whiteness was about social dominance, controlling other people, then whiteness is incompatible with Christian discipleship, because the way of Jesus is the anti-lording over others way of life, right? Literally, that's what Jesus tells, right, in Matthew 20. He literally tells his disciples that the Gentiles lord it over you, but not so among you, right, literally. So those two things are incompatible. And so we just kind of had a conversation around what that would mean, what that means to think about whiteness as relations to dominance, right? And then we kind of went on our separate ways, and the conference continued on. But as we left that lunchtime, I stepped out of the room and went down the hall, and I was just kind of hanging out, leaning against the wall, and there was a white woman who was in the room at the time, and she began to walk over towards me, and she came up and she said, "Hey, what did you think about the conversation that we were having in there?" And I said, I thought it was pretty interesting, And she said, "Well, what do you think about the statement that white people can't be Christians?" And I said, "Oh, all right, I already see where some things fell off and we missed, right, what was actually being said." So I said, "Well, I don't think they were saying that white people can't be Christians. That's not what was being said, but they were saying that whiteness is a marker of social dominance. That's a socially constructed way in which Europeans have defined themselves in response to other people in the world, right?" And I explained, like, there was a time when Europeans would not have considered themselves white, right? Like, if you talk to someone in the 12th century, right, from Germany or something, and you said that they were white, they'd look at you funny and wouldn't know what you're talking about, right? That wasn't a social identity marker that all of Europe was collectively this amassed white group. In fact, there would have been a lot of hostility between all the different European groups. They wouldn't have seen themselves all as one people, certainly. And so the very idea that whiteness is a marker for social dominance is something that developed over time, and it's not about skin color, it's about a way of being in the world, right? That what we're talking about here is it's not a skin color issue, it's a way of being in the world and relating to others in the world. That's what the conversation we're having in the room. That's what I tried to explain. And as I was saying that, she starts crying, and I'm like, oh no, I'm gonna get myself in trouble here. The black guy's making the white woman cry in public. This is not exactly what I wanted to go down. I got to make a quick decision. Do I keep going or do I stop? But I figured, like, here we are. We're at this convening where clearly she cares about justice. She wouldn't even be here in the first place if she didn't care about justice. She was in the room, so she must care about these issues. So let me keep going. And so I kept going, and I explained. I said, look, I can tell, like, clearly, your identity is probably really bound up in the word white in ways that you probably haven't even realized, right? Because a lot of white people they don't even think of themselves as white. They just think they're just individuals walking, right? And so I explained, like, there's probably ways in which you haven't even realized how you've been socialized and how tight your identity is bound up in the very idea of being white. And I said that there's, the conversations that we were having in the room were kind of advanced conversations, right? These are not like small talk, barbershop conversations or elevator talks, right? These were advanced conversations that assumed that people at least understood some basic things around the development of race and what it meant and how it has shaped our world. And so, like, you might be more, like, if it was a book, more at the beginning of the book, and there's some catching up that you need to do to get to this level where we can actually have a substantial conversation on race, right? And she actually nodded and actually agreed with me, and so I challenged her to, go out and do the work to actually learn the history of how white people became white people, right? To investigate that, to be curious about it, and try to understand what exactly went on. How did people begin to identify themselves in that way, and how did that relate to how they're encountering the so-called new worlds, right? Going to Africa and the Americas and Asia, right? For these first encounters, how are all these things bound up together, and why did Europeans eventually colonize and conquest land and enslave people, right? All of these things are all bound together. And it's, again, I told her, it's not about skin color, but it is about ways of being in the world. And so whiteness, we can talk about being white in terms of the way you look, but no one is actually white or black or any of these things, right? These are symbols that represent something beyond that, right? So when we're talking about whiteness, we're talking about ways of being and thinking and moving in the world and relating to others. And I think that's helpful for us also to think about whiteness, not merely just, sometimes we're just talking about skin color. I think that's actually missing the boat if we're not thinking about how we're being socialized in the world to interact with others, right? That is fundamental to our question that we need to figure out. Next slide. So Benjamin Franklin, our dear Benjamin Franklin, he would be what you would have called an Anglo-Saxon chauvinist. Which would have been very popular at the time that he was alive, along with other folks like Thomas Jefferson and such, who believed that Anglo-Saxons, right, Anglo-Saxon Protestants were defined what it really meant to be white, right, and other folks were more questionably white, if white at all. So here's a quote. He says, "Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we would call a swarthy complexion, as the Germans also. The Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I wish their numbers were increased." All right, that's Benjamin Franklin. Again, you can hear very similar things from Thomas Jefferson as well. But this idea was that what it really meant to be a white people, to be white in our society, was to be Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? And so that actually, in the United States, now it was different globally, right? But in the United States, the definition and the ideal of what it meant to be white was centered, and the skeleton of it is Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, right? And it's important for us to understand that historically, and what goes on after that, is this development, this Anglo-Saxon chauvinism in which even Germans and Italians and Jewish and Irish, who many have had hard times initially coming into this country, precisely because Anglo-Saxon Protestantism was defined as what it meant to be properly white, right, from its very origins. Next slide. And so you have what they call old stock and new stock immigrants, right? And we're talking about Europeans now for a moment. We're talking about old stock and new stock immigrants. New stock immigrants were deemed inferior to Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? They're not quite fitting the bill. And so what needs to happen is that these outsiders now, right, these Europeans, if they want to fully assimilate into society, they've got to reconstruct themselves and become white. They've got to achieve whiteness, right, if they want to fully assimilate into American society. So to find belonging, they had to assimilate into whiteness by rejecting their identity and, to some degrees, their connection to their particular ethnic and cultural heritage. For many, this included anglicizing their name, losing touch with their family's language, and severing ties with their homeland and its customs and traditions, right? Sometimes to different degrees, but you can see this happening over and over again by various European groups. Even with these costs, though, people were willing to perform whiteness, right? Because why? The social advantages for doing so were deemed to be greater than the costs that they were willing to go through, right? And so there's this historical period in which, even though they're being belittled and even though people are being deemed inferior, they see the advantages socially of achieving whiteness as more valuable than holding on tight to customs and heritage and culture in a really strong, significant way. And so you see this ongoing process of assimilation into whiteness that begins to happen. Next slide. You can really get the sense of how powerful the value of whiteness was by looking at immigrants, non-European immigrants immigrating into the United States at a kind of, you could say, a fluid period in its racial understanding still in the early 20th century, where again, you could see the arbitrariness of race and what it meant for people. And so what happened is that you have folks like Asian Indians and Syrians coming and suing for white status in the court systems, right? Because if they were, according to to the pseudo-scientific categories, they're Caucasian, right, a lot of them, and so they should have standing as white, right, and so they would go to the courts. Sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't. Here's a quote from a book called The Color of Wealth. It says, "Court decisions on white status were based on a mix of supposedly scientific criteria and the common understandings of the day, leading to a mess of contradictions. Syrians were deemed white in 1909, 1910, and 1915, but not in 1913 or 1914. Asian Indians won white status in 1910, 1913, 1919, and 1920, but not in 1909, 1917, or any time after 1923. The persistence of immigrants in suing for whiteness is evidence of the financial and social benefits that came with white status. After all, no one sued to be considered Asian, much less black, right? As they entered this land, it was very obvious the value of being deemed white, and you understand why people were willing to try to assimilate into it, try to achieve it, try to perform it, and even go to the courts for it, right? It had a game-changing effect in terms of how you would be able to navigate and access our society all throughout the 20th century, and so it was clearly a valuable thing to possess, right? It's like MasterCard or whatever. They don't leave home without it. That's what people did not want to leave home without whiteness. Next slide. Now, whiteness isn't only just a social problem. There's actually some theological things that the church needs to be thinking about if we're going to take serious this idea of whiteness. And one of those things is that over time, what we see is that many of the so-called Christian European nations, right, that's what we call them at least, deem themselves to be the chosen people of God. Like everybody thought that they were the chosen people of God. Certainly, the United States certainly fits in that mold, right? As identifying and thinking of ourselves as the chosen people of God. Germany certainly thought that they were the chosen people of God. The English, right, they thought that they were the chosen people of God. And so this way of seeing oneself as the chosen people of God was repeated throughout various nations. Some of this happened that over time, what happened in the West is that, of course, Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jew, right, living under Roman occupation, but over time, that story got kind of diminished, right? And what eventually happened in people's mindsets is that Jesus was kind of severed of his Jewishness and was kind of recast and refigured as like a Western hero, right? As a possession of the West. In my class, I didn't come up with the term, my students came up with the term of a copyright on Jesus, right? That eventually they imagined to have a copyright on Jesus, as if Jesus was naturally and organically just an outflow of Western civilization, right? He's one of us. He represents the best of our wisdom and culture and society and practices, right? And so he's severed, literally, not only figuratively and visually, but in any substantial way from his origins and his own community, and refigured as a Western hero, right? And so all of the West reimagines themselves as the home, the natural, organic home of Christianity, right? And God being the God of our civilization as well. With that then comes what I call a loss of Gentile identity. Actually, folks like Willie James Jennings, great black theologian who's done some really good work, him and J. Cameron Carter, done some really interesting work on this, but thinking about what are the consequences of this move, right? Is that there's a loss of Gentile identity. People don't see themselves as Gentiles anymore. Rather, we are the home of Jesus. We are the natural home, and it's these heathen worlds out there, right? They're the problems, right? And we own Jesus, we own God. Jesus now looks like us. He's a symbol for our society. The Bible, when you read the Bible, then, for all the good that comes out of vernacular translations, right? One of the challenges is that people forget that it's a translation, right? And people forget that that they need to actually enter into the world of somebody else, another people's stories being passed down, and to think about what that means. Instead, they imagine that people need to enter into our story and reimagine themselves from our place. And so people go out and they see themselves as the new Israel, ready to claim the land. That certainly was the narrative in the United States, right? This was destined for us to take, and so they could displace the Native Americans, and we could do whatever we want. This was lands given by God. We're a chosen people. And so again, in all these different ways, this idea of chosen people functioned as a part of the development of white identity as it's forming and making sense of itself, right? That some of the social performance is a distorted and dysfunctional theology in itself that begins to emerge that allows for these kind of social practices as people are identifying themselves as white in society. Next slide. So along with that then, and this idea of being an exceptional people really takes root, right? What does it mean, exceptionalism, right? American exceptionalism certainly is probably the most prime example again. But it really has roots going all the way back to the first century by a first century writer by the name of Tacitus, who's later discovered, much later, right? Centuries later, but he's found, and Tacitus describes these people who have like pure blood and like these just really great ways of governing, right? And it doesn't actually say that much, but people like saw that and like ran with it. And so this idea that Anglo-Saxons, going back to this Anglo-Saxon chauvinist idea, right? They ran with this idea that we need to keep our pure blood, and we have a superior way of governing ourselves than everybody else in the world, right? And so this ways of thinking about their exceptionalism kind of runs wild and is also one of the things that's taking place as white identity is forming and people are interacting around the world. And so this myth of exceptionalism is expanded eventually to include white people, right? Not just Anglo-Saxons, the skeleton, but it gets expanded to anybody that fits under this umbrella that gets widened, right? Anybody can deem to be white and achieves whiteness, they are also part of this exceptionalism, but it's not everybody in the country is deemed exceptional, right? Black people and Native Americans particularly were never deemed exceptional, though we were a part of this country the whole time. So this ongoing idea of American exceptionalism, I argue, actually requires 400 years of violent white supremacy history, like the forcible removal of Native Americans, the enslavement of African people. All those things have to be kind of displaced to tell the story of exceptionalism, right? Because those two stories are almost incompatible. 400 years of Native American genocide and enslavement of African people is not really compatible with a story of exceptionalism if we actually look at the details of what actually happened and how long it actually occurred over the course of history. Next slide. The next thing that was going on during these times is that, so you have the Enlightenment and this kind of growing sense and this belief that science is going to really help us improve the world and improve ourselves. And there's a growing sense of certainty in our objectivity, right? Our capacity to know, right? To see the world and to know. And so during modernity, race is happening, and modernity actually gives confidence to race, right? The idea that people can be objective observers of society. So at this time, people are going around, they're categorizing plants and animals, and they figure we can just go ahead and categorize human beings too. And it's pretty obvious that there's a scale and a hierarchy, right? And so that we can categorize those who are most superior, clearly the Europeans, and that there's a scale, and then all the way at the bottom, over and over again, Africans, right? And so Europeans would go out, and from their vantage point, obviously, in reality, a biased one, and obviously it was pseudoscience, but they imagine themselves to be objective classifiers of humanity. And so all the great thinkers like Immanuel Kant and all these great philosophers, right, they're all participating in this creating hierarchies of humanity. So it's not people sometimes think about race or originating out of like low-educated average people. It's actually elites and scholars that are actually doing the heavy lifting and work to create and shape our imagination for race. And so even still today, I mean, through that legacy, people often still think of race as a biological and scientific category rather than pseudoscience and a socially constructed idea that people came up with, right? That race in and of itself, at least from that vantage point, is a socially constructed idea, and the modernity, the logics of modernity actually gave people confidence to think that they could actually observe and observe right what was going on in the world, right, without any kind of epistemological humility in what they were looking at and observing around them. Next slide. So what happens with all of that? Right? What happens when you combine all these things together, right? And you encounter, then you go to the so-called new world, right? And you encounter somebody and you say you're going to bring them Jesus, right? And you say, here's your come to Jesus moment. All things must die, all things must become new. Right, so then they go out and they do their work and they say they're being made in the image of Jesus, and they got to cut their hair, change their clothes, anglicize their names, cut themselves off from their practices and stories and tribes and communities, and live and move and think like Western civilized people, right? In the name of Jesus, of course. All right, the white way becomes the right way to do everything. We actually give a moral and theological layer to just social difference. And it becomes hard for us to even imagine otherwise. And maybe this might be a little overt, but in some ways, the ramifications, the consequences of this still go on, that we still take for granted that the white way is the right way in many, many ways. Next slide. One of the challenges in responding to whiteness is sometimes we don't even have the language to disciple people out of all these problems, right? I found that historically the best language that most people have had so far has usually been the language of white privilege, right? That's kind of been the approach that at least for the past few decades most people have approached, trying to help white people make sense of this and kind of move forward. I'll tell you a story for why I think it has failed in its work. I remember watching a video, and there was a black gentleman, and he was speaking. I'm familiar with him, and he was speaking, and he was speaking to a mostly white audience, and he talked, and he said, I remember this time when some white friends, they went overseas, and they were in Africa, and there was some kind of injustice thing going on, and they came into the place, and everybody, all the Africans stood up straight, and they responded, and then they were able to kind of sort things out and fix things, right? And so he talked about how the respect that they got, and so then his answer then at the end of it was, see how they stewarded their white privilege for good. And I was watching, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. Something doesn't sound off there, right? Something sounds a little off. I mean, so like we got 400 years of white supremacy and white people controlling and dominating society, and here the answer is white people come in here and start controlling and dominating the situation for good? Steward your white privilege? Something don't seem right there, right? Racial hierarchy, remember that whole racial hierarchy still in its place? Superiority, sense of superiority, savior. That the language of white privilege itself has not necessarily opened up for many people an option for where to go. I mean, I think so I try. I mean, maybe it's not fair, but I try to put myself in a place of white person, thinking about like, if I was told I had white privilege, how would I respond to that? And I think about the common ways that people often respond, right? I've sat in circles where, well, of course, there's obviously some people who just get very defensive and shut down, right? That's obviously one quick way, right, is the defensiveness. But then there's been times where I've sat in circles where people are like counting the history and stuff, and white people are crying around the circle, and tears are coming down, and that's fine and all, but it just seemed like the work was just confessing over and over again how terrible they were, right? And I was thinking like, that's not really helping anybody get anywhere. That's just, the work can't just be just perpetual confessing of guilt and feeling bad about oneself. And then I think, well, certainly there's this idea of using it for good, but that seems to, again, to not really get to the root of the problem, and it seems to create new problems in trying to solve problems, even though sometimes people have good intent. People sometimes just get stuck. I mean, I think that it hasn't often done the work. And then on top of that, it's almost like an umbrella term that almost doesn't mean anything anymore. It could use for everything and anything, right? Everything is white privilege, and sometimes people mean economics, sometimes they don't mean economics, sometimes they mean interaction, sometimes they say white privilege, they mean white experience or white supremacy. It kind of gets used as like a umbrella term for everything, and it kind of gets confusing, and sometimes, people haven't done a good job of talking to, let's say, a poor white person from the Appalachians, right, who's poor, dirt poor, their whole communities are dirt poor. They're also experiencing exclusion and isolation and a lack of access. And oftentimes how we talk about white privilege doesn't seem to make sense for their lived experiences. So my gut is that it hasn't done the work, and that it tends to often, while there's some folks that can, I know folks that have heard that word, have taken it, and have somehow just kind of like done and just kind of go running with it, right? But I feel like that's, the word itself it's like the person is able to see more than the word itself. But I think it's so individualistic sometimes, right? It's so centered on me, the individual, that it's not helping people frame the history and the larger systemic stuff and thinking about how do I navigate faithfully in the midst of these realities, right? None of us created the world that it is, but all of us inherit this world as it is, right? And have to then respond to the way, what we've inherited, not because we created it, because we've inherited it, right? How do we think about it on the broader social, systemic, and structural level, and think about how do we faithfully navigate the world as it is now, rather than just thinking about accounting for my privileges individualistically as the starting point, right? I think we need a broader starting point. That's why I even use the language of white supremacy much more than I start with the language of white privilege. And so for me, not that I'm against the word, but I don't think it's always done the work. We have to sometimes think about what are our goals? What are we trying to point people towards, especially when we're talking about Christian formation, right? If we want people to do the work, what is the goals and how are we describing where we want people to go? What kind of transformation needs to happen and what kind of language best describes that? I would have longer conversations on some of the ways I'm trying to process that, but we don't have time for that today. But I do think it is worth us taking very seriously how we kind of process these things. Next slide. All right, and I'm losing, here we go. So, one of the things I think that churches can do is to begin to telling a truthful story about the places that they inhabit, right? And I'm thinking particularly, though I think this is important for all churches, but I am, again, thinking particularly for white churches especially. I've gone and I've traveled, and sometimes I hear things like, well, what about my church? I live in an all-white community, and, we don't have any people of color around. What am I supposed to do? And I think, it's always interesting, like, they imagine that the first thing that they can do is just become a multicultural church is the only answer. But I think, like, to think a little more deeply about the space they inhabit is actually a good first step. And what I mean by that is to tell the story of the place you inhabit, right? Who were the original inhabitants of the land? Going all the way back to the Native Americans, right? Who inhabited that land first? When were they displaced? How were they displaced, right? When was that land established? Who was allowed to live there and who was not allowed, right? Were there sundown towns and deeds created? Were there redlining going on? Were people being hostile to some folks? Were they being welcoming to some other folks, right? Like, what was going on? What is the story that needs to be told? In every land in America, there's a long, huge, and significant story to be told. And I believe that if we can tell that story, know where we've come from, especially locally, we actually have a much more meaningful way of moving forward in the present. And I think that, again, it could be really easy to just hope that people of color will come and make you more diverse. But you can just perpetuate, all kinds of stuff, even in a multiracial church, if you haven't dealt with the really roots of racism. And so I think from a historical standpoint, understanding where you come from, to understand where you're going is an important starting point to telling a more truthful story, right? The church ought to be a place where we could tell the truth, right? That includes displacement and genocide and enslavement and redlining and Jim Crow and all those kind of things that are, in many ways, those who has access in particular neighborhoods is still a reality, right? And it might shape how we, Willie James Jennings, he talks about like churches need to show up when they're doing like zoning in the neighborhoods and stuff like that. Where's the church? Why aren't we showing up to these things? When people are making big long-term decisions about what kind of buildings and what kind of zoning and stuff like that, we should be present to make sure that we're kind of creating the kind of equitable new world that we want to see, and not just being passive participants as it's being structured around us, right? Those are important things that we can all be doing. Next slide. So in Philippians 2, 5-8, it says, you should have the same attitude toward one another that Christ Jesus had, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a slave, by looking like other men, and by sharing in human nature. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death. Clearly, there's so many things that we could draw from this passage, but one of the things is the self-emptying that Jesus does, right? And I think that really has a lot to do, when we go back to the very idea of whiteness, not skin color, right, but social performance, right? A way of lording over others, maybe is another way of saying it, right? That when we get to that idea, this idea of self-emptying, of rejecting that kind of way of relating to others as a central Christological form of life, right? That the way of Jesus actually draws us into a very different kind of life that empties out of that kind of posture of superiority and dominance over others, and calls us then to, it says that he took on the form of both a slave and took on human form, right? And I think that those two things are interesting. On one hand, to say that he took on human form is to talk about the way in which Jesus has universal implications for all of us, right? Our shared humanity. He enters into our shared humanity, and in that way, he has something, it means something for all and each and every one of us. And at the same time, it doesn't only say that, it also says that he took on the form of the slave, of the doulos, right? Somebody vulnerable in society, right? That Jesus always entered into the lives, and through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see that he comes alongside those who are the least, the last, and the lost of society, right? Those on the cracks and edges and those most exploited and vulnerable in society, the vulnerable women and the Samaritans and the poor and the oppressed in his society are the folks that he just clings to, right? And so there's something particular about that kind of human being, right? On one hand, Jesus has universal implications, but there's something also particular about the life that he lived, right? That it was particularly invested in and caring about those who are most vulnerable in society. And I think certainly, we're still having these conversations around even like, why use Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting, like, the universal has no meaning outside of how it gets enfleshed in the particular, right? For Jesus, it's one thing to say he cares about, he enters into human nature, but it's the particular way that he enters in that actually really demonstrates the significance of that. And that is, again, in solidarity with those who are most vulnerable in society. I think for us as Christians then, how do we live out a gospel, a good news, the way of Jesus that both demonstrates the universal significance of that for all God's children, and at the same time is unabashedly in solidarity with those who are most vulnerable in our communities, right? I think that has to be a central commitment if we're going to be doing the work of challenging racism and fighting injustice in our societies. That kind of posture, and doing so even to the point of death, right? That we accept the consequences that come with faithfulness to Jesus as a part of the call and the commands that we have to take seriously if we're going to be followers of Jesus Christ. All right, so you can skip 2 slides, and we're going to just go straight to the questions to keep it moving. All right, so let's dialogue again, and here's the 3 questions. Where does normalizing and overvaluing whiteness show up in our Christian communities, in our neighborhoods? What kinds of Christian practices or disciplines should be adopted to form our people faithfully to resist white supremacy and normativity? What might imitating Jesus' kenosis, self-emptying, look like for white people normed by white supremacy's pervasiveness in our society? So again, the first question, where does this normalizing and overvaluing whiteness show up? And I actually hope, I know that some of these, the other two might feel like a little bit more focused for white people, but the first question is actually a question for all of us. How does normalizing whiteness and valuing whiteness show up in our Christian communities is something that I think all of us need to interrogate very seriously. Anyway, all right, I'll let you guys, again, break into conversations and discuss together.